Captain Rhodes was a woman who had mastered the art of looking ordinary. To the casual passenger who glanced through the open cockpit door before takeoff, she was simply another commercial airline pilot, competent, polite, and tucked neatly into her pressed Navy uniform. Her smile was reassuring, her voice steady over the intercom, and her hands rested lightly on the controls as if they had always belonged there. For the passengers of Flight 762, scheduled to fly from Denver to New York, was invisible in the way most pilots are, trusted, respected, but ultimately unremarkable. The aircraft itself, a 757, hummed quietly as it prepared for departure. Mechanics completed their last checks, baggage handlers secured the cargo doors, and flight attendants performed their well-practiced rituals of safety demonstrations. Inside the cockpit, flipped switches with calm precision. She had done this thousands of times, but her mind never grew careless. Each movement was intentional, each response deliberate. The co-pilot, a young man named who had just recently upgraded from regional jets, glanced at her with a nervous smile. "Smooth day for flying," he said, though his voice cracked slightly as if hopping to convince himself. Offered a small nod. "Smooth skis are earned, not given," she replied. Her tone was firm but kind, a mixture of authority and mentorship. Admired her. Everyone did. She carried an aura that didn't need to announce itself, confidence that came from experience but also from something deeper that nobody could quite name. Behind them, 179 passengers shuffled into their seats, oblivious to the storm waiting on their horizon. Families with children, business travelers hunched over laptops, retirees clutching travel guides, all of them trusted to ferry them safely through the skis. To them, she was a face they would never remember. To her, they were lives she would guard with an unspoken vow. What no one knew, not the flight attendants, not even the airline's executives, was that life had once been very different. Years before she sat in the left seat of a passenger jet, she had soared through the skis in an entirely different uniform. Back then, the call sign Raven had been painted onto the side of her fighter jet. She had trained with men who considered themselves wolves of the sky, and she had most of them. Her maneuvers were sharp, her instincts sharper. In the world of aerial combat, she had been more than competent. She had been remarkable. But never spoke of that past. The military chapter of her life had ended quietly, almost abruptly, after a tragedy that left scars too deep for casual conversation. She folded away her patches and medals, stuffed them into a box that gathered dust in her attic, and turned to the civilian skis. Commercial aviation was meant to be safe, predictable, and anonymous. Here, she could blend in. Here, she could fly without remembering. On this September morning, the sky was flawless, a dome of blue stretching endlessly above the Rockies. The 757 lifted from the runway with practiced grace, its engines roaring before settling into the steady hum of cruise. Guided it skyward, leveling off at 30,000 feet. She leaned back slightly, allowing to handle the radio calls. For a moment, it truly did seem like an ordinary flight. Passengers unbuckled, ordered drinks, and tapped away at phones. Flight attendants rolled carts down the aisles, their laughter soft and controlled. Children pressed their noses to windows, watching the earth shrink into patterns of green and brown. In the cockpit, relaxed, finally breathing easier. "This is the part I love," he said, "just smooth sailing." Gave him a small, unreadable smile. She didn't tell him what she knew, that smooth skis could shatter in an instant. She didn't tell him that instincts mattered more than manuals, that sometimes the unexpected came screaming out of nowhere. She didn't tell him that she still dreamt of cockpits that weren't painted in civilian gray, but in military black, with instruments meant for combat, not comfort. Instead, she said, "Enjoy the quiet, it doesn't always last." Her words carried more weight than realized, because high above the clouds, as the passengers sipped their coffees and the co-pilot hummed under his breath, fate was already twisting the calm into chaos. Somewhere ahead in the endless blue, Flight 762 was about to encounter the kind of disaster no simulator could prepare for. And when it came, the world would learn that Captain Rhodes was far more than just a commercial pilot. The morning sun poured through the cockpit windows, casting golden light across the controls as Flight 762 sailed eastward. The Rockies were far behind them now, the land flattening into patchwork plains. Glanced at the gauges, noting everything was normal, fuel flow steady, altitude perfect, engines purring. She allowed herself a quiet breath of satisfaction. Then it happened. A loud bang reverberated through the fuselage, followed instantly by a shudder so violent that its headset nearly flew off. Warning lights erupted across the panel like fireworks, red, amber, flashing relentlessly. A shrill alarm filled the cockpit, demanding attention. His eyes snapped to the engine displays. Both engines were losing thrust. "Engine 1 failure," shouted, fumbling for the checklist. His voice cut through the chaos. "I see it. Engine 2 also failing. We're losing both." Within seconds, the roar of jet turbines faded into an eerie silence, leaving only the rush of wind as the 757 transformed from powered aircraft into a 200,000-pound glider. The sudden quiet unnerved Even. His breath hitched audibly. Behind them, the cabin reacted. Passengers gasped, coffee cups toppled, and children cried as the oxygen masks dropped with a hollow thud. Screams filled the aisles, overlapping with the metallic rattle of unsecured luggage. Flight attendants struggled to calm people, their practiced smiles faltering as they strapped themselves in. His hands moved with speed and certainty, disconnecting the autopilot and gripping the yoke firmly. "I have control," she declared. "You have control," repeated, though his voice cracked with fear. His hands shook as he attempted to radio air traffic control. "Denver Center, this is Flight 762. We've lost both engines, repeat, both engines. We are declaring an emergency." The reply came, strained but steady. "Flight 762, Roger, say your intentions." Intentions. Almost laughed at the absurdity of the word. What intentions could they possibly have falling out of the sky? But she kept her voice calm. "Stand by." Her mind worked at a speed couldn't follow. Standard operating procedure dictated they search for the nearest airport, attempt a glide approach, and pray. But they were too far. The 757 was heavy, laden with passengers and fuel, and it was bleeding altitude fast. Even at perfect glide efficiency, the numbers didn't add up. They wouldn't make it. His eyes darted wildly between the maps and the terrain visible below. "Closest field is Lincoln Municipal. We're not gonna make it." His panic was rising. His voice hardened, cutting through. "Focus, we've trained for emergencies." But even as she said it, she knew this wasn't in any manual. No commercial simulator in the world prepared for total dual-engine loss with no reachable runway. The nose of the aircraft dipped as gravity claimed its prize. Adjusted pitch, coaxing the glide out as far as possible. She felt every shudder in the airframe, every whisper of resistance in the yoke. The passengers' panic reached a crescendo. A woman cried out for her children. A man prayed loudly. Someone shouted accusations. "What's happening?" The flight attendants' reassurances rang hollow. Blocked it out. The cockpit was her battlefield now. Her heart pounded, but her voice remained as steady as steel. "We're going to need an unconventional solution." Looked at her, pale and sweating. "What are you talking about? There isn't a solution." But knew differently. Somewhere deep within her, instincts stirred, the kind drilled into her years ago at Air Force Base. She could almost hear her old instructor's voice. "When the book fails you, trust your hands. The sky doesn't forgive hesitation." She steadied her grip, her eyes narrowing as if she were back in a fighter jet, staring down the impossible. This wasn't going to be saved by civilian training. The only way forward was the way she had buried long ago. The passengers of Flight 762 thought they were in the hands of a calm, ordinary airline captain. What they didn't know was that the woman guiding their fate had once been trained to survive the worst skis imaginable. And today, she was about to remember every secret she had tried so hard to forget. Flight 762 was descending rapidly, the ground rushing up at an impossible speed. The engines were silent, the roar of jet power replaced by the eerie whine of wind slicing past the fuselage. Hands gripped the yoke like a lifeline, her eyes scanning instruments, terrain, and every possible option. Every calculation, every instinct screamed at her. The standard glide approach would not suffice. No airport in range could handle the heavy aircraft in its current condition. Every second was a battle with gravity itself, and failure meant catastrophe. His hands shook on the throttle, though the throttles no longer responded. "Captain, we're going to hit." His voice cracked, fear choking every syllable. He glanced at as if hoping she could conjure a miracle. His lips pressed into a thin line. "There's one option," she said quietly, almost to herself. Then, louder, "I need you to trust me completely." "Trust you? You're asking me to do what?" His panic sharpened. Didn't answer. Her mind was already replaying patterns she hadn't used in years, the drills, the maneuvers, the precise recovery sequences she had learned in the military. In her youth, she had flown F-15s, dodged missiles in simulations, and mastered recovery maneuvers that conventional logic. All of that training, once a buried part of her life, now surged back. Every muscle, every reflex remembered. The plane was too heavy to turn sharply, too fast to glide with standard efficiency, and yet there was one sliver of hope, an abandoned airstrip visible in the distance. Military, not civilian, abandoned but intact. Too short, too narrow, but the only chance. Ran the numbers mentally. She could align the glide, roll into a precise angle, and bring the nose down just enough to land safely. But it was risky, too risky. One miscalculation, one slight delay, and they would cartwheel across the runway. Swallowed hard. "You're insane." Ignored him. Not insane, experienced. She didn't reveal the half-truth, that this was instinct, born from years of classified Top Gun training, from hours spent pushing aircraft past human limits. Commercial manuals couldn't teach this. No airline simulator had prepared her for this. The plane tilted slightly to the left as she executed the first minor adjustment, testing the glide. It responded perfectly, the fuselage humming with controlled tension. Felt her heartbeat synchronize with the vibration of the craft. She could see the runway growing larger, closer, yet terrifyingly narrow. The passengers were oblivious to how close to disaster they were. They had no idea that they were riding on the edge of impossible mathematics, that a single misstep could cost all of them. "Brace for a heavy landing," she instructed calmly, though the words didn't convey the danger. Flight attendants secured themselves, passengers gripped armrests, and a young boy peeked through his fingers at the rapidly approaching Earth. Adjusted the controls once more, executing a maneuver that would have been deemed reckless by civilian standards. A precise roll to reduce speed, a calculated dive to align with the runway centerline, and a gentle flare at the last possible second to soften impact. The plane obeyed as though it were an extension of her body, a living instrument shaped by years of elite training. His jaw dropped. How are you doing this?" Gave him a brief glance, calm, unreadable. "I've flown heavier, faster, more dangerous aircraft. This is just another challenge." The seconds stretched like hours. The runway expanded beneath them, sparks of tension lighting every nerve. The aircraft's belly grazed the tarmac, shuddering violently, and for a heartbeat it seemed the impossible was failing. Then, slowly, gradually, the landing stabilized. Maintained control, coaxing the plane forward with subtle adjustments, guiding 179 lives across the threshold of disaster and into hope. As the 757 finally slowed, allowed herself a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Every passenger, unaware of just how close they had come to death, began to stir. The impossible decision had been made, and it had worked. Yet in the cockpit didn't smile. The crisis wasn't over. Air traffic control was still calling. Emergency crews were rushing to intercept, and somewhere above, fighter jets had noticed the strange, impossible descent pattern of a civilian airliner. However, all that mattered in that moment was one simple truth. Her secret training had returned just when it was needed most, and she had not failed. High above the planes, radar screens blinked insistently in the command centers of the Air Force. Flight 762, a civilian 757, was off course, descending faster than protocol allowed. Controllers double-checked data. It couldn't be right. Both engines were out. The autopilot was disengaged. The plane seemed to be executing impossible maneuvers, banking sharply while maintaining a glide no commercial pilot should be capable of. Within minutes, 2 F-22 Raptors roared into the sky, their afterburners cutting through the thin morning air. Pilots in the cockpits of the fighters scanned the airliner, bewildered. Their eyes widened as Flight 762 executed a controlled roll, aligning with a distant airstrip in a manner that physics. "What the hell is that civilian doing?" one pilot muttered, astonishment and confusion thick in his voice. The Raptors fell into formation, keeping the plane in their sights, prepared for emergency interception. Yet even as they followed, it became clear that the 757 was no ordinary aircraft today. Every tilt, every maneuver, executed with uncanny precision, mirrored the aerobatics they had only ever seen in advanced fighter simulations. These were not the actions of a commercial pilot. They were the fingerprints of a trained combat aviator. In the cockpit of the lead Raptor, Captain Jason Hayes clenched his jaw. "I've flown with some of the best," he muttered into his headset, "and I've never seen a civilian fly like that. Whoever's in that cockpit, they're dangerous and brilliant." Oblivious to the jets streaking past her peripheral vision, kept her focus entirely on Flight 762. Every movement of the plane was deliberate, calculated. She adjusted glide angle, managed airflow, and manipulated the flaps with instincts that seemed almost preternatural. The passengers were unaware of the Raptor escorts, seeing only a slight shadow through the clouds or a faint roar. To them, was simply in control. To the F-22 pilots, she was an enigma. As Flight 762 neared the abandoned military airstrip, the Raptors observed her precision approach. She executed a banking maneuver to counteract turbulence, keeping the plane steady despite its weight and lack of engine thrust. Jason Hayes, watching the airliner, nearly swore aloud. "It's like she's trained in combat aviation," he said. His wingman, Sarah, nodded grimly. "No civilian could fly like this. She's Top Gun caliber." On the ground, military personnel began monitoring the emergency, alerted by the unusual radar signature. Cameras on the airstrip's old control tower captured a sight rarely witnessed: a commercial airliner maneuvering with the finesse and precision of a fighter jet. The reports would later be filed under unidentified exceptional pilot, though the name behind the was already known to a select few within the Air Force. Back in the cockpit, maintained her serene exterior. The Raptor pilot's presence was irrelevant. She didn't need them to guide her. This was instinct, muscle memory, and decades of training converging at the exact moment they were needed. Every calculated tilt, every adjustment of speed, was invisible to the passengers yet utterly critical. Glanced at, astonishment etched across his face. "They're military jets," he whispered, eyes wide. "They're following us." Didn't respond. Her focus was unbroken, her mind racing through calculations as she approached the final stretch of runway. The Raptors maintained formation, awed and cautious. It became painfully obvious to the pilots of the F-22s that whoever controlled this aircraft was not just skilled, they were exceptional, someone who had mastered techniques long forgotten in the civilian world. The jets escorted her for a few tense moments, witnessing maneuvers that would later be classified. Even the most elite military pilots in the air could not replicate what she was accomplishing, and yet remained calm, almost serene, as if guiding the plane were as routine as pouring coffee in the galley. The contrast between the terror inside the cabin and the precision in the cockpit was stark, highlighting the extraordinary nature of her abilities. By the time Flight 762 touched the runway safely, the Raptors had already radioed their astonishment. Air traffic control and military command centers alike were stunned. Rhodes had just performed maneuvers that were supposed to be impossible for a commercial aircraft and for a civilian pilot. And though the passengers would only later realize they had survived a near-impossible disaster, the F-22 pilots already whispered among themselves. The name Rhodes would become a legend in their circles, a mystery that blurred the line between civilian pilot and Top Gun warrior. As Flight 762 hurtled toward the ground, Rhodes felt the old instincts awaken within her, precise and unrelenting. For decades she had tried to bury this part of herself, the days when she had been Raven, a fighter pilot at Air Force Base, one of the few women to train with the elite Top Gun instructors. She had learned to push aircraft beyond their limits, to maneuver at impossible angles, to trust her gut when the numbers on a panel didn't add up. That training had been her secret, carefully locked away after she left the service. Back then she had been fearless, soaring through simulated dogfights and emergency drills that would make most pilots break into a cold sweat. She had executed inverted rolls, zero-thrust recoveries, and emergency glide maneuvers under conditions far worse than anything a commercial plane could face. The instructors had called her precise, relentless, and unflinching. Yet behind every accolade, a shadow lingered. The death of her wingman during a training exercise had left her questioning the life she had chosen. The tragedy had forced her to resign, to trade the chaos of combat skis for the predictability of civilian routes. She had told no one, not even her family, that the calm, controlled woman who now flew domestic airliners had once been a Top Gun prodigy, had buried her past under routine flights, schedules, and airline regulations. Commercial aviation was supposed to be safe, predictable, anonymous. But today, with the engines dead and 179 lives at stake, that past surged forward like a tidal wave, demanding to be remembered. Her hands adjusted the yoke with precision, muscles moving as if they had never forgotten. She assessed the glide path, the wind currents, the angle of descent, all with the ease of someone who had trained in far more dangerous skis. It must have seemed like magic. To the passengers, she was simply calm and competent. But every adjustment, every tilt of the wings, every calculation of speed and altitude was a memory of Top Gun drills performed years before. Recalled the instructor's voice echoing in her mind. A pilot doesn't wait for opportunity. They create it. Trust the aircraft. Trust yourself. She applied that wisdom instinctively. When she angled the fuselage for a slight roll, it wasn't guesswork. It was the product of hundreds of hours spent mastering maneuvers that civilians weren't allowed to know. When she countered turbulence mid-glide, it wasn't luck. It was training encoded into her muscle memory. Stared at her wide-eyed as the plane responded like a fighter jet rather than a passenger airliner. "Captain, I've never seen anyone do this before," he stammered. Didn't answer him. She didn't have to. Words were irrelevant. The passengers' lives depended on her focus, on her ability to execute maneuvers far beyond the scope of civilian aviation manuals. She could feel the runway approaching, distant but attainable, and she adjusted the plane's attitude with surgical precision. For a fleeting moment, her mind flashed back to her final days in the Air Force, the medal ceremonies, the camaraderie, the exhilaration of pushing a jet to its limits. And then the shadow returned, her wingman's final words, the hollow ache of loss. That pain had driven her from the military, but it also shaped her decisions today. She would not let history repeat itself. Failure was not an option. The sun reflected off the fuselage as prepared for the approach, the old hangars of the abandoned military airstrip appearing below. She could see the rough tarmac, the faded markings, and the uneven surface. But she was ready. Her Top Gun training gave her an edge no ordinary commercial pilot could possess. She trusted her instincts, the plane, and her own hands implicitly. The hidden past was no longer hidden. It had returned in the cockpit of Flight 762, guiding her toward an impossible landing. For the first time in years, realized that her secret skills, the ones she had once thought were too dangerous for civilian life, were exactly what she needed to save 179 souls. She tightened her grip on the yoke. One final glide, one final roll, one final chance. The abandoned military runway stretched ahead like a narrow ribbon of hope. Rhodes tightened her grip on the yoke, feeling the familiar hum of the aircraft respond to her commands. Every passenger, every crew member, every life on board now depended on her precision. The engines were silent, the usual backup of thrust gone. This was no ordinary landing. It would require every ounce of her buried training, every instinct honed in the Top Gun program, and a courage she had learned only under fire. The 757 shuddered in the wind. Turbulence swept across the planes below, lifting and tilting the massive fuselage. Adjusted the flaps with meticulous care, guiding the glide with the skill of a pilot who had spent years pushing aircraft past limits civilians couldn't imagine. Behind her, his hands hovered uselessly on the controls, awestruck. I don't understand. How are you doing this?" he whispered. Lips pressed together. She didn't answer. Words were unnecessary. Every maneuver was a silent calculation, a life-or-death chess move in 3 dimensions. She angled the wings, countered the gusts, and brought the nose down just enough to maintain the glide without stalling. The runway, worn and uneven, drew closer with terrifying speed. In the cabin, passengers screamed, clutched armrests, and prayed. Flight attendants braced themselves, their faces pale but determined. Some didn't know why they trusted, only that she radiated calm authority, a force that demanded faith. Children hid behind seats, their wide eyes reflecting fear and awe. Yet through all the chaos, focus was absolute. She could feel the plane as if it were an extension of her body, every vibration, every shudder a message she understood instinctively. The first contact was violent. The landing gear hit the runway with a screeching roar, tires bursting as sparks flew against the cracked tarmac. Held firm, countering every bounce, every sway, guiding the massive plane with surgeon-like precision. His face was pale, and for a moment he thought they would cartwheel into disaster. But slowly, millimeter by millimeter, brought the plane to stability. She didn't allow herself relief. The runway was short and the plane had to stop before the end. She applied the brakes carefully, used the spoilers, and let gravity assist in deceleration. Every second felt like an eternity, every movement critical. The 757 shuddered violently, then gradually slowed. Silence fell inside the cockpit, broken only by the hiss of air brakes and the settling of tires on tarmac. Finally, the plane came to a stop, shuddering once more before resting fully. A collective gasp escaped from the cabin. Passengers unbuckled themselves, tears streaming, hands shaking. Flight attendants hugged children, reassured passengers, and checked the aisles. The improbable had occurred. 179 lives, intact, saved against all odds. Outside, the F-22 Raptors circled, their pilots reporting in awe. "That was unbelievable," muttered Captain Jason Hayes. "I've never seen a civilian handle a jet like that." Behind the awe was respect. The pilots knew what they had witnessed was extraordinary, something beyond manuals, beyond conventional training. Exhaled slowly, her knuckles white on the yoke. She allowed herself one small smile, glancing at. He finally met her eyes, a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Captain, you saved them all," he said softly. She nodded quietly, almost humbly. "We saved them," she corrected, acknowledging the teamwork. But deep down, she knew her hidden past had made the difference. The skills she thought she had left behind, the Top Gun maneuvers she had buried, had returned precisely when needed most. Emergency crews began rushing to the aircraft. Passengers poured out, overwhelmed but alive. Cameras captured the miraculous landing, a story that would soon make headlines. And in the cockpit, Rhodes allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. She had done the impossible. She had saved 179 lives. But even as relief washed over her, knew that this story was far from over. The F-22 pilots had witnessed her skill, the Air Force had noticed her maneuvers, and the world would soon ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. For now, though, she allowed herself a single thought. Everyone was alive, and that was enough. The roar of emergency vehicles filled the air as fire trucks and ambulances surrounded Flight 762. Passengers stumbled out of the plane, hugging loved ones, crying and laughing in disbelief. News crews were already arriving, cameras capturing the miraculous landing that had just occurred. Yet behind the chaos of celebration and relief, a quieter, more intense drama unfolded. Military authorities had been alerted immediately. Radar logs and flight recordings had already been analyzed by F-22 pilots and command center operators. The maneuvers performed by the 757 were extraordinary, impossible for a civilian aircraft under normal conditions. Captain Jason Hayes and his wingman, Sarah, had watched the approach and landing in awe. Their reports were filled with disbelief. Unbelievable control civilian. Impossible. Investigators, airline officials, and Air Force liaisons flooded the scene. Still seated in the cockpit was surrounded by a swarm of questions. "Captain Rhodes, how did you maintain control?" asked one investigator. "Did you follow emergency protocols?" Another pressed. Pale and still processing the adrenaline, offered his account but could only attest to his calmness and apparent instinct. Responded with the practiced humility she had honed over years in the commercial sector. "I just relied on experience," she said, her voice steady. "The plane and I worked together. That's all." Her words were technically true, yet deliberately vague. She offered no hint of her military past, no acknowledgement of the advanced training that had made the landing possible. The F-22 pilots' reports, however, told a different story. Radar footage and flight logs indicated maneuvers that mirrored advanced fighter techniques, precise roll corrections, glide management, and calculated counteractions to turbulence that no civilian pilot would attempt. The Air Force quietly filed the data, labeling it Extraordinary Civilian Maneuver, under review, knowing full well who had flown the plane. Airline executives, meanwhile, were ecstatic but puzzled. Had saved 179 lives, avoided catastrophe, and executed a landing that would become legend in aviation circles. Yet no one could understand exactly how she had done it. Manuals, checklists, and standard procedures offered no explanation. Her secret remained intact, hidden behind her calm composure and quiet smile. Passengers, unaware of the technical genius behind their survival, called her a hero, showering her with gratitude and questions. Children hugged her flight attendant heroes, while adults pressed her for interviews, remained gracious but discreet. "I'm just glad everyone is safe," she repeated, deflecting attention. She understood that the true story, the one involving years of hidden training and Top Gun maneuvers, was not hers to tell publicly. Behind the scenes, the military was abuzz. F-22 pilots shared their astonishment with colleagues, using careful, hushed language. "Did you see her glide angles?" one whispered. "She flew that 757 like a fighter jet." Another nodded grimly. "Top Gun level, no doubt. That civilian isn't ordinary." Yet despite their curiosity, the pilots respected the boundary, had performed flawlessly, and her privacy, for now, remained intact. By the end of the day, Flight 762's passengers were safe, the plane secured, and headlines beginning to spread across media outlets. "Pilot performs miracle landing. 179 saved in midair crisis. Commercial pilot defies odds." Rhodes' face would be recognized worldwide, but few would ever know the full story. The question lingered: how had an ordinary commercial pilot achieved the impossible? The answer was buried deep in classified training files, and the memory of a pilot who had once flown among the elite, hidden in plain sight. Finally unbuckled and stepped onto the tarmac, eyes scanning the crowd of passengers, emergency crews, and journalists. She allowed herself a quiet moment of pride but gave no interviews, no explanations beyond what was necessary. Inside, she knew the truth, the secret of her skill, the hidden past that had saved 179 lives, remained her own. Questions could be asked endlessly, but answers would come only when she chose, or when the Air Force reminded the world who she truly was. And for now, she smiled faintly, walking past the chaos, a hero who had saved lives and kept her secrets intact. By the next morning, the story of Flight 762 had spread across the globe. Headlines screamed of miraculous survival, heroic composure, and the pilot who had saved 179 lives under impossible circumstances. Passengers recounted their terror and relief in interviews, praising Rhodes for her calm demeanor and seemingly supernatural skill. Television crews camped outside her home, newspapers printed her photograph, and social media buzzed with admiration. To the public, she was a hero, a symbol of courage and composure under pressure. Yet remained remarkably calm, almost as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She smiled politely at reporters, answered questions with grace, and emphasized the teamwork of her co-pilot, cabin crew, and ground staff. "It was a collective effort," she said softly, though in truth, the decision-making and maneuvers had rested entirely on her shoulders. She did not mention the training that had allowed her to perform the impossible, the years spent in fighter jets, the drills no civilian was permitted to learn, or the precise techniques that had physics. Meanwhile, the military quietly cataloged the event. Radar logs, flight recordings, and pilot testimonies revealed a civilian aircraft performing maneuvers that resembled advanced fighter techniques. F-22 pilots who had escorted the airliner marveled at the precision, whispering in astonishment, "She wasn't just lucky, she's Top Gun level." Among Air Force insiders, Rhodes became a legend, known not as a celebrity, but as a pilot whose skills had transcended categories, a civilian who had executed fighter-grade maneuvers in a commercial jet and survived with every life intact. Returned to her routine flights after the incident, treating each takeoff and landing with her characteristic calm precision. Passengers continued to praise her in private, unaware of the full story. To them, she was simply the pilot who had guided them safely through the impossible. To the Air Force, however, she was a reminder of hidden potential, a living proof that extraordinary skill could lie quietly in ordinary places. Her co-pilot often looked at her in quiet awe, still struggling to comprehend the grace and skill she had displayed. "I still don't understand how you did it," he confessed one evening after a flight, gave him a small, knowing smile. "Some things can't be explained," she replied, "but when it matters most, instinct takes over." In the public eye, story became iconic. Books would later recount the miracle landing. Documentaries would interview passengers and crew. Aviation schools would cite her composure and decision-making as exemplary. Yet in all accounts, the full truth remained elusive. Only those who had served with her, who knew her past in the Air Force and her Top Gun training, understood the depth of her abilities. Even years later, pilots spoke of her with reverence. Military trainees were quietly told tales of the commercial captain who had flown like a fighter pilot, a woman who could bring down an aircraft from the brink of destruction with courage and precision unmatched by most. Her story became legend not because she sought fame, but because extraordinary skill leaves a lasting impression. Herself never sought recognition. She continued her flights, greeted passengers, and lived quietly, content in knowing she had saved 179 lives. But among those who understood aviation, she was immortalized, not in medals or headlines but in whispered respect. The woman who had taken the skis, faced the impossible, and reminded the world that extraordinary heroes can exist anywhere, even in plain sight. And so the legend of Captain Rhodes endured. To the world, she was a hero of a single miraculous flight. To the Air Force and the pilots who witnessed her maneuvers, she was a living testament to skill, training, and instinct, a secret Top Gun whose abilities would inspire awe for generations to come.